He had rehearsed the moment in his head for months. The hollow click of the front gate at dusk, the soft sigh of wind through the pines lining the drive, the way the kitchen light would slice the dusk into two rectangles on the floor. After 18 months in the desert, after patrols and sandstorms and nights, when the sky was bitter and raw, Ethan Kane imagined himself stepping across his threshold as if into the final chapter of a book. Home would smell like lavender and coffee. Home would have hand-scrawled notes on the fridge and his name on the mailbox. Home would have a woman waiting with eyes like flint and worry, ready to laugh that brittle laugh he loved. When his Humvee rolled through the gate and the engine died, the house was quiet, too quiet. The porch light was on, and the motion sensors flared as he carried his duffel up the steps. His heart thudded, not with the manic adrenaline of war, but with something taut and hollower, like a string pulled so tight it might snap. From the road he could see silhouettes through the living room windows, two bodies on the couch, a glass on the coffee table, the errant spill of a blanket. The posture was intimate, familiar, the kind people who had spent years together and knew how to fit hands into each other's contours used. Ethan's breath hitched. Abby. She stood when he knocked. For one irrational second, he thought she would run into him, that the years of letters and late-night calls and careful boxes of embroidered tea towels would have been enough to keep them tethered. Instead, she froze like an animal caught in floodlight, her face shifting through stages he recognized. Surprise, then an attempt at composed neutrality, then slipping guilt. Behind her, Greg Mercer rose slowly from the couch. Greg, his oldest friend since before puberty, someone who drunk beer from the same grimy styrofoam cups and argued about music until dawn. Greg had been one of the reasons Ethan had enlisted. He'd needed a friend to anchor him when the world tilted. And over the years, that anchoring had been more like an anchor that occasionally let itself be dragged across the ocean floor without concern. Greg's eyes slit, a flash of something like sheepish triumph passing over his face. The scene was worse, of course, than Ethan's rehearsals had ever allowed. There were coats on the dining chairs, expensive clothing strewn in a way that suggested recent intimacy rather than a casual visit. A line of empty prescription bottles like white teeth leaned against the ashtray on the table, Abby's name on the labels, in a font Ethan suddenly knew better. An unfamiliar envelope lay open on the counter. Inside, a glossy card from an investment firm, stamped with his name, and a figure that made his stomach do a quick, involuntary tuck. "You're home," Abby said. Her lips moved around the phrase as though it had a thorn. Ethan. For a long second he did not speak. The world had narrowed into a single chamber of sound, the fan in the kitchen, the soft clink of ice in glass, the distant hum of traffic. Then the training took over, the soldier's quiet control, and he said simply, "Hi." Greg's smile was too bright, like someone trying on a suit that wasn't his. "Mate, didn't expect to." He looked at Abby, at Ethan. He swallowed and found the sentence again. "Ethan, you're back." Abby's face collapsed into something raw and human. "I didn't know, Ethan, they." "You didn't know," Ethan repeated. He kept his voice measured, which made his insides burn all the hotter. "You got my mail, Abby. You had access to my bank while I was deployed. You told the VA I was dealing with PTSD and I couldn't work. You used my benefits. You cashed my checks. You replaced our savings statement with a forged one so you could cut me out. You didn't know." Her hands flew up, pleading. "I needed." "Needed," Ethan echoed. He could feel the years of forgiveness crowding against the rim of his patience. Needed what? New shoes. Greg tried to step forward. "Ethan, look." Ethan's laugh was a dry, sudden sound. "You pick my best friend to screw my future with. That's rich, Greg." Abby was crying now. It wasn't the theatrically exaggerated type of sob meant to convince someone else of hurt. These were small, frightened whimpers, the ones people make when they realize a plan has fallen apart and there's no way out. Greg said, "We didn't think you'd come back early. You were scheduled for." "I came back when I could. I'm here." Ethan's hands curled into fists at his sides. "You used my name at the benefits office, Abby. You listed yourself as my legal representative. You collected disability payments. You sold things from our storage and used the money. You lied to my friends, to my mother." Silence pressed into the house. The living room lamp hummed on as if it were waiting for the next beat. When he finally left, it wasn't dramatic. He didn't slam doors or shout. He didn't tear anything down to make a point. He packed a bag with a few essentials and walked out because the house itself had become an accusation. The driveway tasted of salt and leftover diesel. The moon rose, thin and indifferent, and Ethan rode through it like a man walking out of a cloud of smoke. The weeks that followed were a disciplined kind of grief. Ethan rented a small apartment above a dry cleaner's, a place where the humming of commercial washers was a metronome that kept his sleep in time. He spent mornings at the county clerk's office, unpicking forged signatures and reclaiming hacked accounts. The process was mechanical and infuriating. For every document he corrected, 2 more inconsistencies sprang up like mold. Abby had eaten through savings with a meticulous greed, charging him out of existence, the way a termite devours a beam from within. Greg kept calling at odd hours, sometimes apologetic, sometimes terrible and bold. "I can cover some things, Kane," he said once, voice lower than the courthouse tapes. "Listen, I've got contacts. I can help you sort it out. We'll make it right." Ethan didn't know if Greg was offering to help or trying to smooth over an arrangement. He knew from the unforgiving geometry of things that 3 people shaped the old world: his wife, who'd used the house like a bank until even the mortgage felt a stranger; Greg, who had fed on that arrangement; and him, the man they'd presumed absent enough that his absence became a space to exploit. The more Ethan learned, the less he could reconcile himself to simple revenge. He wanted practical answers. How had Abby gotten access to his benefits? What did Greg gain? Why had Abby tried to kill him? "She tried to kill you?" people asked, incredulous when the rumor slipped out. It sounded like a bad movie. Ethan told the story matter-of-factly because he had no appetite for melodrama. The blacked-out brakes on his truck in the weeks after he'd returned, the mailer that tried to lure him to a bogus financial seminar. The subtle sabotage of his personal effects that could all have been staged as an accident. But when he said, "tried to kill me," eyes widened as if to accept the hint of grand drama he himself did not always feel. He got a job at a security firm, something that fed the muscle memory of patrols and perimeter checks. He trained dogs on the weekends. He did what soldiers do when they're in the grip of something they can't fix with emotion. He built. But the gnawing question of money and motive wouldn't leave him. Abby had been clever. She had been careful. For someone who'd chosen a lover who was his oldest friend, she had been surgical in the way she'd repurposed every brick of his life into currency. For a woman who'd written him love letters from the kitchen table at 2 in the morning while he was 2 time zones away, she had been cold and precise about money. Ethan smelled a plan, and he sniffed it out until the scent led him to a quiet answer. He had always known, in that slow peripheral way you know things about people you've loved, that Abby had an eye for luxury. Even as she shredded their life insurance policies so she could live off his benefits, she'd bought things on the sly, artful things that did not match up with their declared budget. In a shoebox in the closet, he found receipts, private clinic payments, deposit slips for a trust in a name he'd never heard, transfers to an account in a small Delaware shell. He followed the paper like a breadcrumb trail. It led him to places money likes to hide: shell corporations, private accounts, a string of properties paid in cash in a town 2 hours away. The trail had been laid slowly, as if built by someone who expected to be able to use it for years. That person had used his name to qualify for benefits, used his status as a veteran to secure loans on his good credit, and rerouted funds before he'd returned. Greg's involvement came into sharper relief. He had signed documents, introduced Abby to an accountant who specialized in creative financial planning, and used his outward charm to mute any suspicion. The final small victory came when Ethan wrenched open an account he didn't know existed. A single innocuous creditor had sent a letter with an invoice enclosed. In it was an address, one of those small townhouses with peeling trim, and the name of the trust, Kestrel Holdings. The trust held 4 properties, a pair of classic cars in climate-controlled storage, and a small but significant portfolio of municipal bonds, all purchased in cash. Ethically, legally, Abby had tried to kill him. Practically, she had been laundering his benefits into a version of the American dream, a self-sustaining retirement plan without him in the picture. He could have made the report to authorities and watched Abby end up in cuffs. He could have pressed charges that would have frozen the accounts, but he didn't want to bask in the small, retributive joy of the law. The way he felt about Abby wasn't just anger, it was a complicated interlacing of hatred, pity, and a weary kind of curiosity. More than anything, he wanted to understand why the woman who knew every sliver of his soul had repurposed it into profit. So he did the unmilitary thing. He stayed close, pretending to hope for reconciliation. He let his face territory the places where she could see it plainly. He kept his visits infrequent but plausible, and each time he came, he watched the house like a bird of prey. He listened to the muted hum of the refrigerator and the clack of Abby's heels on the floor. He paid attention to details, the way she looked at the mail when it came, the way she kept a spare key under a potted plant, the way Greg would sometimes call and let his voice curl into warmth. If she was trying to kill him, she was clumsy at it. The brake line on his truck had been sanded and then sealed again, something a diligent mechanic could trace. A vial of a slow-working anticoagulant had been planted in his protein drink once, but Abby, no amateur when it came to deception, was careless in her haste, and the bottle she'd procured had been mislabeled by the pharmacy clerk, an old man with a taste for gossip who'd come forward when Ethan left a not-so-subtle question about whether she'd been buying. People make mistakes. Money makes processes transparent. One late autumn evening, as frost rimed the windows and the smell of wood smoke hung like a benediction, Ethan arrived at the house to find Abby with a suitcase. Her hair had that drawn-through look of a woman who'd been crying and then washed her face to start again. Greg was there, but his coat was heavier than the evening demanded, a sign he wasn't leaving. "Ethan," Abby said without preamble, "I." For a heartbeat, Ethan indulged a fantasy of them stepping into a small, bright reconciliation where she would admit everything and they'd find laughter and maybe a therapy cooch. The fantasy died like a moth against glass. "You know I won't forgive you," he said. "Not with what you did, not with what you've been taking." She closed the suitcase as if it were a case for some fragile truth. "You're being dramatic," she said. "I did what I had to. You were gone. People suffer. I did what was necessary. You can't lecture me about survival." "Your survival didn't require fraud," Ethan said. "It required." He stopped because he could taste the sermon on his tongue and didn't want to become something he would later regret. "You made choices." Abby's face hardened in that moment. "It's funny," she said. "You always wanted to be a hero, Ethan. You left to save strangers, but you were easy to spare. They fall in love with the uniform and the absence. You come back and expect everything to be the same. People adapt." Greg's hand brushed Abby's back in a gesture that could be read as comfort or possession. Ethan looked at him and in the glance found the arithmetic of betrayal, not sudden, not murderous, but the small slide of one man into another woman's life when an invitation was given. "You're leaving?" Ethan asked. Abby shrugged. "Greg and I are going away. We'll settle someplace warm. I got the last of the money transferred this morning. You won't have to worry about any of it." "Don't call your theft worry," Ethan said. "Call it a crime." She laughed. It was brittle, and it was not without contempt. "You think anyone will even listen? They like veterans on paper, Ethan. They like veterans who can be quietly kept out of the way. You'll be labeled an unstable ex-soldier. They don't look closely when the papers say domestic settlement." His body made a small real movement then, a lurch of something like fear and hunger. "Where are you going to hide the money?" "The trust takes care of that," Greg said, stepping forward as if to manage the conversation. "We set things up right. It's all clean. We didn't steal from you. We merely used the avenues available." "We didn't steal from you," Abby repeated, and she sounded, for the first time, like someone who had convinced herself. "We used the system. You wouldn't have wanted to live the way we planned. You would have been miserable on benefits, Ethan. You're a soldier. You're suited to hardship." "You're not," the words pressed like stones in Ethan's mouth. "You're not giving me credit. You think I'm just a man easy to remove. You think I'm naive." Greg's jaw tightened. "Look, man, you're making this hard. We're just trying to move on." "Moving on," Ethan said. "I think I'll move myself into your life for a bit." His grin was unexpectedly cold. I want to know where you keep the keys." Before either of them could react, he turned and walked into the house. There was a brief while where only the sound of his boots echoed. Abby's scream came too late. He had the keys and the access and the knowledge of where the safe was hidden behind a false wall in the study. It had been his design, because sometimes a man builds a house for love and also to keep his things secure. He opened the safe with a trembling precision. Inside was not the petty cash he expected, but a ledger bound with elastic. He took it and sat on the sofa, and as he turned pages, the soft scrape of paper seemed like the clicking of little gears in some mechanism. The ledger was not all the money that had been laundered. It was the accounting of an operation, an inventory of purchases, payments, and names, Greg's included. The entries were clinical and efficient. She'd run the numbers like a business. He read until his eyes burned. "I knew you'd come," Abby said, a single syllable from the doorway. "Now you're going to tell me everything," he said. She sat across from him and didn't lie. She told a story of loneliness, the dryness of months when he was away, and the steady drip of a bank account that couldn't be replaced without extraordinary measures. She told of Greg's promises, of the accountant he'd found who specialized in veteran benefits, and how they'd convinced themselves their maneuvering was ethical, of the thrill of buying property in cash and closing old doors. She told him about the attempts to nudge him out of the way, how they had tampered with his truck, how they'd tried to get him to accept help that would make him dependent. She spoke of a plan that had metastasized into desperation once the transfers sped up. When she reached the part about the plan to murder him, she did not explain away the intent so much as she explained the mechanics: an attempt to cause a heart attack while he drove, a dose of drugs slipped into his supplement pills, the relaxation of a brake line. It read more like a series of trial runs than a single decisive murder. She told it with a professional's lack of shame. She had never wanted him dead, she insisted. She had wanted a world clean of complication. Ethan listened and catalogued. Every confession was another rung on the ladder he could use. "Why are you telling me this?" he asked when she was done. "Because I'm tired," she said simply, "and because Greg is an animal and he wants to increase his stake. He threatened to expose the trust if I didn't give him more. He said he wanted to cut you out entirely." Ethan's laugh that came then had no humor. "Your lover blackmails you, what a twist." They argued then, and their argument had no clarity. It was the old, corrosive kind of dialogue where both sides excavated what they knew to be true about the other. After a while, Greg left the room and Abby slumped back, as if the air itself had been lifted. "You could take the ledger and go to the cops," she said finally. "You could make me look like a criminal. You could ruin me." Ethan looked at the book. The ledger had names of private accounts and numbers that could make creditors shiver. It had copies of deeds and false certificates, details of payments that could be traced to shell corporations. He could destroy her with it. The ledger was a loaded weapon of a different sort, revelation not just for justice, but for ruin. He saw, in one of his clear moments, that he could become the exact thing he despised, a man who used the law as a blade. Instead, he closed the ledger and slid it into his jacket pocket. "There are ways to make people pay besides prison," he said. "What do you mean?" "I'm not going to press charges," he said. "Not yet. You're doing something I think a lot of people would do when pushed, bad things, selfish things, but I want to watch. I want to see what happens when your house collapses inward. Greg's not as careful as he thinks. He leaves traces. He talks too loud. He has pride." Abby's fingers tightened around the armrest. "You're going to blackmail us?" she asked, a corner of the old sarcasm returning. "I'm going to give you a chance to set it right," Ethan said. "You either undo the harm you've done, return the money, dismantle the trust, sell the properties, and put the proceeds where they belong, or I hand everything to the right people and watch them fall." The threat sat in the room like a slow, gathering storm. Abby's face became a hard, polished thing, but it was quivering at the edges. "You don't understand what you've done by staying," she said. "You've made yourself vulnerable." "Vulnerability's a different kind of strength," Ethan replied. He was not entirely sure anymore what kind of man he wanted to be, settler or avenger. For the first time since he'd imagined returning home, he felt a strange appreciation for the moral ambiguity of the choices he'd been handed. He didn't know if he was morally right. he only knew what he wanted: restitution and the dismantling of a fragile house of cards. They came to an arrangement that was a fragile compromise. Abby would liquidate enough assets to cover what she and Greg had taken plus interest. She would close Kestrel Holdings and transfer the remaining funds to a conservatorship with audited oversight. Greg, on the run for a few weeks, pushed back then acquiesced when he realized Ethan had leverage he had not anticipated. There were threats, pitched voices, slammed doors, but Abby made payments under the watchful eye of an auditor Ethan arranged through an old army contact who owed him a favor. And yet the ledger revealed something else. The scales tipped. When he probed the shell accounts, he found the unexpected. They were not all for Abby or Greg. There were deposits with tags like Meridian Consulting and Phoenix Ventures, into which sums flowed that were clearly investments, then redirected into offshore accounts. Greg had been enriching himself in ways more complex than merely keeping a lover. The more Ethan followed the threads, the more he realized that people he had trusted had used his absence to build private foundations that, if left intact, would make them independently wealthy. He kept his strategy tight and professional. He filed civil suits when necessary to reclaim assets. He used the ledger where it was most effective, threatening prosecution only when it would compel a bank to reverse an illicit transfer. Sometimes the law worked like a blunt instrument, sometimes it worked like a scalpel. Slowly, surreptitiously, he retrieved what belonged to him. One night, as snow began to powder the quiet streets and windows held their warm lights like secrets, Ethan arrived at the house to find Abby packing her car. There was a small box on the table with a photo in it, one of the earliest photos they had, two college kids in a cramped apartment, laughing over a cheap pizza. She had kept it. He paused, then reached for the box. "You've done as you promised," he said. "The auditor will finalize the transfer next week. The accounts will be cleaned." She looked at him with a kind of ruinous relief. "Thank you," she said. "Really." He wanted to say something that would show him as magnanimous. Instead, he said, "Don't call me when you need money. Call me when you're ready to apologize." She smiled then, small and ashamed, and climbed into her car. As she drove away down the frosted lane, Ethan watched until her taillights were swallowed by the dark.